Hello and welcome back to our review series on Odyssey. After lambasting the hell out of the base game, I'd thought that the DLC would right the horse and lead it off into something legitimately interesting, or at least not terrible enough to smash my keyboard to bits writing the script. Well, not that dramatically at least. Let's just say that when Ubisoft started putting out these episodes 6 months after release, they definitely looked like something they'd put together in 6 months. Like other products that Ubisoft puts out that promises something deeper looking into the Assassin-Templar conflict, First Blade also fell flat on its face, not bothering to develop the story to any great degree because Ubisoft needs this hamster wheel to run for eternity, which precludes any sort of conclusive game releases. Although, there was a little bit of interest peaking in First Blade since it also tried to be a legitimate capper for Alexios' story rather than the failed ending where Alexios ends up being sad around the corpses of his mom and sister for 2 minutes, goes home to fall asleep, and immediately forgets about the family drama quest that pushed him through his 30-day journey on the high seas. So, who is the First Blade? Well, the story begins with Alexios being caught up in some local shenanigans regarding local bandit raids against small villages. You know, the normal shit he always does. Alexios wraps it all up in about 5 seconds, but instead of the usual, he ends up getting entangled in a battle with a stranger who can actually keep up with his combat. After drawing down to a draw, the character escapes further questioning, and Alexios quickly meets up with a local girl, Natakis, who is looking further into the shenanigans of the raids. While putting down his blade to help deal with it, Alexios soon learns that the person he was tangling with is actually named Darius, a traveling killer who lives with Natakis, and are personally in danger from the raiding party, and live in that village they were trying to destroy. Alexios gets a plan from them, and the three begin investigating what's actually going on and where it's coming from. The problem with First Blade is that Ubisoft didn't put in any of the unique region, or really any above-average assets for their DLC. It just feels like they really strung together a bunch of random quests from the types of the main game, threw in a few new NPCs drawn from pre-existing assets, and then put those missions in pre-existing locations and towns that were already in the main game. The entire product feels like an incredibly lazy slapdash that they're trying to charge a premium for, and unfortunately, what could have been there to save such an asset-flippy DLC, the story cannot hold the weight of this lacking presentation. You'll go on to the same document location, bandit crushing, ship fighting, NPC conversing quest as always, like it's just another chapter from the main game that was sectioned off for real money for no real good reason, kind of like Assassin's Creed 2. It does raise a couple interesting points about Alexios' character arc, but then it doesn't really question it, it doesn't affect him, and the game just ends. For the first chapter, after helping out the locals, Alexios' investigation soon reaches that there's actually a local warlord named the Hunter lurking in the area that's the one actually commanding the jobs. He tracks him down to a grisly scene of quite a lot of local villagers strung up dead on some random tree in a field. The Hunter confronts Alexios directly about the sculpture, claiming that the people strung up are representative of the people killed along Alexios' journey, raising the point that if Alexios didn't actually get involved, none of the citizens would have actually been killed. What makes it worse is that the Hunter's speech riles up the family and widows of the slain to turn against Alexios at that moment, who then begin to try to attack him and egg him on to kill those people in another conflict forced by his involvement. It's a classic moral lesson that Spec Ops The Line already asked. If you hadn't gone into this situation, the conflict wouldn't have erupted, but at the very least, it's a moral question to chew on, even though the Templars are so obviously evil and the only reason the citizens are rising up is because of Templar propaganda, that Alexios is the direct cause of every person they've ever met being dead. The point is just incredibly muddled, but I can give it a tiny, insignificant bit of respect towards Yubi's writers for at least trying something a bit different. It's a good idea for an encounter, a prelude to the actual boss fight, but the black and whiteness of the characters involved leaves a lot to be desired, which is why the argument feels so token, is because only one side actually has the sympathy of the audience. Since the hunter has decided to reveal himself, Alexios and his two friends can begin tracking him down to his actual lair and finishing what they're doing. It's a quick couple missions to figure it out with barely any more investigations to be done because they already know where he is. When the team does finally corner him, a neat boss fight does happen where the hunter uses poison-based attacks and a couple dirty tricks to try and throw Alexios off his game enough to get the kill, which is kinda scary since late game status ailments can really make or break any sort of attempt. Again, it's not just a copy-paste of an earlier enemy given bigger stats. At the very least, Ubisoft did plan out a unique battle for the final mission of episode 1. The hunter dies after a few minutes, giving Darius and Antagonists a bit of a reprieve from their violent lives. However, they need to leave. They've been doing the murder hobo thing long enough to realize what's actually coming. The Order of Ancients, who is the new Templars for this DLC, are going to send more killers to track them down, and so they'll have to be moving along. In episode 1, we learn that Darius has a past that he doesn't really want anyone to know about. He used to be a high-ranking Persian military man, since this DLC has the Persians as the central villains who are more powerful than anything Alexios has fought before. They have better weapons, and they're more organized. And after a Templar sympathizer was raised to the throne after the miraculous murdering of Xerxes, he ended up getting split apart from his former allies because things were actually becoming stable under the new ruler, and so he was cast out from the society for trying to raise his blade to the new ruler because he was afraid that he was going down the Templar path. Somewhere between that and now, he kind of adopted Natakis as his daughter, and they've kind of been together ever since, trying to survive in a quite brutal scenario. He's not quite an assassin, but he has made his own hidden blade and does follow a proto-assassin creed, and that's basically who Darius is. Episode 2 begins a while later, when Alexios gets a letter calling him back to work with Darius. Unfortunately, there's a situation somewhere else that they've moved to that needs some dealing with. The Order has sent down some more troops to look for them, and they're currently seeking passage out of the Greek world for the obvious reason, but they actually got beaten to the punch somehow because the Order has managed to lock down all seafaring from the new town where they live. Along with that, Natakis has also been seeking to help the local population from being oppressed by the new Order arrivals. Darius does not want to get involved since it does put them in incredible risk to try and spearhead a new resistance, but on the other hand, he does want to encourage Natakis' helpfulness so that they have a plan to start throwing out the invaders because he's kind of the brains of the operation. After securing their new safe haven, Alexios and Darius begin working with the local resistance to start forming a movement to topple the oppressors who work for the Tempest, who is the next sadistic killer that's commanding the new battalion of the Order. However, they have a major problem that they need to deal with, and that's the Chimera's Breath, a flaming cannon she's planning to mount on her flagship. However, the designer is actually a Resistance sympathizer, so he immediately has a way to get into this. Unfortunately, and there's always an unfortunately, the inventor was not secured correctly, so a bit later the Tempest had her secret killed, but forgot to smuggle away the schematic he devised, so Alexios now manages to have the weapon he needs after Barnabas is able to read his scribbling. To get the manpower, Alexios locates the two resistance leaders in the town and begins helping them free prisoners, kill local commanders, and get some supplies that they'll need for later. After he manages to rouse the people and get the militia formed correctly, along with getting their new Chimera's Breath ready for Alexios' ship, the assault is ready to begin. Alexios takes his ship and runs it directly into the Scylla, Tempest's flagship, and manages to sink it under the heavy fires and kill most of the crew. The Tempest manages to escape to a nearby island for their final encounter. Beforehand, the Resistance leader shows up with Alexios on that island and tries to convince the Tempest beforehand to leave the Order immediately, because it turned out in the story that the Tempest was actually the daughter of the militia leader. However, like Deimos, it doesn't go terribly well and the mother dies on the island, and this leads to an incredibly angry Tempest and a nail-on-chalkboard's boss fight since she has tons of health and a couple high-damage moves that wrecked my shit. Wouldn't have guessed, but Ubisoft actually got a challenging boss every now and again in the story. After failing to kill the Tainted One again, the Tempest gains some small solace in going to the afterlife alongside her forgotten mother. Now that the villagers have been rescued and the docks are finally open for business, Darius and Natakis begin planning another leave for outside the Greek realm because they have to stop running into bullshit. However, something occurs to Alexios now that he's been talking to a couple people about actually retiring from his mercenary lifestyle to something quiet and serene. He manages to convince both of them to stay with him and invest in his idyllic lifestyle dream. They've been running for their entire lives, and it might actually have a home that they can settle in. Surprisingly, they decide to agree to the idea and decide to live with Alexios on a small farmstead around that village. Alexios even decides during the episode to start a relationship with Natakis, which was the big controversy about First Blade, since this decision to make it required disregards any romantic decision that was actually made in the main game. You know, taking away player choice for the story. It's actually not a shocking revelation to me that Odyssey did this because the game didn't even record those decisions as major ones inside of the main game itself. But I can't even get mad about that since these characters are introduced and killed off within the same DLC. So either way, the controversy doesn't matter because nothing extends beyond the DLC itself. Several months after episode 2, the pair shack up and begin to start a family as they supposedly live happily ever after. That would be if there wasn't the obvious sequel hook showing that the other militia leader they were working with also happened to be Darius' old ally in the Persian army, Amorgus, disguised as that leader guy because he's just so goddamn clever. For literally just being a sandbox game reasons, Alexios decides to go on a 3-month vacation from his family to do a bunch of mercenary work off screen before getting another letter from Darius and Natakis to return to the farm and do some chores as the new father because Alexios, you just had a kid, get your head in the game. This was the first part of First Blade that I actually liked, and it's somehow in episode 3, because it's the one point where they actually do some goddamn character development with this whole family dynamic. Episode 3 begins with Alexios being called back to go pick up some damn groceries, and then go play hide and seek with his kid and wife all throughout the mission, talking about how he feels as a new father, and discussing how Darius and Natakis are beginning to fit into their slow family lives, since it is such a huge difference from their murder hoboing lives. It's a really nice bit of writing compared to how much of a slog the rest of everything was, since the dialogue is actually really relatable and sincere to how a new family life sort of goes. He's really happy that he did it, but he's still apprehensive about the future and his ability to be that provider for his kid, and hoping that the kid doesn't follow in his footsteps because, you know, he kinda killed hundreds of people. Of course, this part about the game is technically boring, so it's simply a soft opener for what the last episode is actually about. The Order is still looking for them, so they begin to send patrols into their small town looking for them, and generally fucking with the villagers. Darius and Alexios have to run a couple missions to start saving the people and securing their home before they get distracted with another horde just long enough for the unthinkable to happen. While all that crazy nonsense was happening, Natakis and their child took shelter in their favorite place on the beach, which is where the Order found them first. Off-screen, Natakis gets killed by the Order, and their kid is also kidnapped by the Order. Obviously, this triggers the Kratos rage in Alexios, pulling in his mercenary powers to go on the typical revenge quest for his fallen wife. So much for all that character development that happened in, half an episode? Darius, on the other hand, refuses to talk to Alexios much about what happened and just slinks off into the night to dwell on his daughter being abruptly murdered. Alexios manages to catch a lead on where Amorgus is hanging out, so he begins tracking him down alone, Since Alexios doesn't actually know much about the New Order presence, he begins tracking down some leads on their whereabouts where he quickly runs into Darius again. The two decide to pair up out of necessity since Darius is still miffed at Alexios about getting his grandson kidnapped, so they both take different missions to start tracking down Democritus, who is a seclusive Order member that Darius doesn't even know what he looks like. Now that we've got a tenuative teamwork going, in order to start getting a grip on where the Order is trying to do, Alexios begins freeing prisoners under their control in order to finally get an actual lead. The missions are typical Odyssey stuff that you've seen before, with maybe a bit more escorting to do in order to make episode 3 feel more exciting. They even have a classic tailing mission in it just to really make it a standout experience. Once all of the extra missions are concluded, Darius and Alexios come up with a new plan to finally find Amorgus. They are going to start a fire at a local farm in order to draw out soldiers that are there and then sneak behind their lines and kill him while everyone's looking the other way. It's a decent enough of a plan, except that Amorgus still happens to have quite the contingent watching his back after everyone leaves. It's a revenge-fueled bloodbath in the mine, especially when it comes to Gurgis, the man that we've talked to earlier who essentially wanted to talk to us peacefully to recite the same bullshit "if you hadn't gotten involved, we're only fighting for peace, you're not seeing the big picture" Templar speech we've heard about before, about how Alexios is somehow the bad guy in all of this. That's why the Order calls him a tainted one. However, since he utterly fails to convince us and the player, now he's fighting us in the mine before Amorgus gets his. Gurgis is a copy-pasted fighter that you'll completely destroy in 30 seconds, so he's not even worth the bother. Thankfully, Amorgus is actually nearby, so we do get to still have our final battle with him, fueled by the frustration that he's still hiding Alexios' kid. Again, Amorgus may have a ton of health, but his tactics are from bosses that we've seen before. Super predictable stuff for a Spartan fighter that we've killed 500 of in the main game. Do a dodge, throw out your supers, and avoid being on fire, and you'll just be perfectly fine if you can maintain that for 12 minutes. It's actually kind of a lame conclusion for this revenge story because Amorgus was only introduced in the story at the end of the last episode, 2/3 of the way in. I mean, come on. Shortly afterwards, Alexios does find out where his son is being held, on some random island 2 miles away. When he arrives, he finds some random guy there taking care of his kid. What a well thought out conclusion. Apparently, he's actually very well off by the guy's own admission. While talking, it turns out that the guy taking care of the kid was actually the child of the new leader of Persia, who tells Alexios that his father is running Persia very well, and he's actually had a good life, which inevitably muddies the water of what Darius was doing before he ended up getting kicked out of Persia. I appreciate the subtle "I told you so," however, the pro gets immediately destroyed by the con because Alexios has decided after spending a couple days with his kid as a single father to make the ultimate sacrifice. Darius is planning on leaving again, and Alexios has taken some of what the Order has said to heart. His lifestyle is dangerous, duh, and it's generating a lot of people trying to kill him. He doesn't want his kid to know the struggle, so he tells Darius to take him away and raise him by himself. Tell his kid that he's loved when he's asked, but not to find his actual father. Now, this could have been the heartfelt moment for the DLC's ending if it wasn't for several things that destroy it completely. 1. The game deliberately gives us no time between episode 2 and 3 to develop Alexios' relationship with his family before they end up getting killed. 2. All of the characters in this DLC only exist in the DLC itself, so we don't actually get to see the benefit of any sort of character arc or time being spent between these characters. And 3, again, because this is a bad sandbox, Alexios doesn't reference his child ever again or shows that it's emotionally affecting him at any point after the abandonment. It's a moment that just doesn't work in a game like this, so I don't freaking care. I can't even remember what the damn kid looked like. This whole abandonment is more about Ubisoft trying to tie together its prequel canon in a way that makes sense with the already established assassin history. It's supposed to be about the first assassin order that'll spawn the rest throughout history, rather than actually concluding Alexios' life story that it should have been, because obviously it's the perfect way to do it. He's been a mercenary for this entire game. He should be doing the opposite thing at the end, because he's finally realized that all the killing he's been doing has actually not led up to anything beneficial for him, and is probably the root cause of everybody he's ever known in his life being dead now. First Blade had the perfect opportunity to be the last bit of character development that Alexios really needed to round out his character after the total failure to manage developing him at all that the main game already did. Alexios learning to embrace that desire to live a quiet life away from all the murder he's been doing and the Templar bullshit of his previous life would have been that interesting last turn that his character arc could have taken, because it would have been the perfect conclusion. But the DLC doesn't spend any of its time focusing on events that would have been meaningful to Alexios, and instead just recycles the same missions from the main game another bunch of times to try and tell another stupid story about Templars being vanquished because they're very, very evil. A story that was incredibly mediocre and boring about a bunch of characters I do not care about that we've been hearing from the Assassin's Creed series about 4 times at this point. One of the characters that became Alexios' wife, and I still give 2 shits about her existence. If this DLC was about previously established characters going through this story that we've been talking to beforehand and developing some sort of preliminary relationship with, this could have worked a little bit better, because it would have been riffing off of something that was already established and we already put investment in. But since everything in this DLC is brand new and only exists in the DLC itself, it holds very little weight and value because it doesn't apply to anything else in the game. Alexios forgets about his kid in exactly the same amount of time that he forgot about his killed mother and sister. The boss fights in this DLC were slightly better than the main game's encounters, but outside of that, the entire package is stuff that we've seen before in the same maps as before, fighting the same enemies as before, and going through typical dialogue trees that go nowhere. First Blade really feels like just another chapter from the main game and nothing more. It doesn't stand out on any of its own merits. The developers really could have done something with that idea they try to go with, that Alexios' actions are breeding conflict and death because he's constantly fighting the Templars. But it doesn't work because the people who are accusing him of that are also the people who accept a mere hundreds of people being killed by their own actions to save the world, not acknowledging the simple fact that their culling of villages that doesn't agree with them are going to continue to happen, so it's a pot calling the kettle black moral argument, therefore completely meaningless. Of course it doesn't go anywhere, especially when they repeat the same argument throughout the DLC multiple times, rather than trying to frame it in a different way so that it's not completely repetitive. The whole thing is Ubisoft trying new things without actually trying anything. Putting development time into meaningless missions and substandard gameplay that we've already done 50 times with threadbare characters and boring as hell conflicts. I can never recommend it because the entire DLC is so monotonous and gray that if you do ever actually play it, you'll forget about it just as quickly as Alexios did. It's a premium experience that couldn't even be bothered to try hard for that extra bit of cash. Thanks, Ubisoft, I fucking hate it.